If you drive just north of Marlin, Texas on Highway 6, and you exit and head towards a small town known as Otto, Texas, eventually, after a few twists and turns and divergences down dusty old back roads, you might come across a small stretch of land significant only for the chain link fence surrounding numerous ancient granite headstones. This particular cemetery is nothing super special. There's nothing about it that would really draw far-off visitors to it. But in the local area around Otto, Texas, including the town of Mart and Riesel, there are legends, there are stories. See, in the arched letters that reach over the front entryway to the cemetery, one reads, Hope Cemetery. And Hope Cemetery has a legend about one grave in particular. A grave near the back that if you approach it after dark, you will notice that it is risen up from the ground, that there is a crack in the earth, and that if you peer just so, you can look deep down into a coffin and see an ancient soul laid to rest. And the legend holds that if you were to touch this grave after dark, then you would be trapped in the cemetery and at the mercy of the spirits there until dawn. This legend may be true, and I have tested it. This is Urban Legends Unmasked, and I am your host, Chad Lehrman. So one fall, around 1994, let's say, 93, 94, my friends and I were camping out. Now, I had a wonderful childhood where my best friend growing up, Jared, was born the day after me. And so oftentimes what would happen is that we would camp out at my house in the country on October 29th, and then on his house the next night, on his birthday, the 30th. And being close to Halloween and being the kids that we were, children of the 90s who absolutely loved horror stories and scary movies and those kind of things, oftentimes the campouts turned supernatural, if you will. You know, a little creepy. We tell ghost stories like anybody else would have, but small towns have stories. And so one of those stories was the story of Hope Cemetery. Now, the story I related to you is the story as it was related to me as a 13-year-old boy by my best friend's father, by Jared's father, Jerry. And as he related the story, of course, he embellished it and he added to it, and he, with great gusto explored this story and challenged us. What do you think? Do you think you can do it? And so we went out to this particular cemetery late at night. And by late at night, I mean like 9. It was dark. That's late enough in this particular story. And so we went out and we gathered in the back of his truck, as children of the 90s were wont to do. And we pulled up to the cemetery and we climbed out. And of course, instantly fear took over. It was dark. It was fall in Texas. So it was this weird mix of like cool, humid air with hot air and bugs and, snakes and everything else. This sound was, adding to the ambiance, if you will. And we all stood there. We all stood and we looked into the cemetery, and we looked at it, and we hemmed and hawed about whether or not we would climb over. And then one of our friends, Matt jumped over the fence, or attempted, I should say, to jump over the fence. And he gripped that chain link fence, and it began to shake with his fearful hands gripping onto it. And he began to try to vault over, and he got about halfway over, and then Matt fell flat on his back. And he screamed or yelled, as I remember. Memories after 30 plus years tend to get a little fuzzy. But he yelled something about being pushed, and we, in terror, jumped in the back of the truck and sped off. Jared's dad drove as quickly as he could to get us out of there, and then promptly got about 100 yards from the gate, stopped, hopped out, and goes, "Wait, where's Jennifer?" This would be Jared's little sister. And of course, he was playing this up. He knew exactly where she was. She was curled up in a ball underneath a whole bunch of coats on the floor of the truck, where she had been throughout the entirety of our little adventure. But it worked. We were terrified. We were scared. And that's what 13-year-old kids did. So the truth is, we never actually got to that particular cemetery. We never got in there. We never touched anything. And Matt, with all due respect, if you're listening to this, I still think you just freaked out. I really don't think you actually got pushed over by some sort of spirit within Hope Cemetery. But I kind of wish you had been. And I say that because there's something about these local legends that are just fun to dive into and to go and explore. I think there's this thing in us that when we're looking into an urban legend or a local lore that has this supernatural element to it, there's a part of us that desperately wants this evil, dark spirit to be real. And an equal part of us that definitely wants it to be a story. And that's the beauty of horror, and that's the beauty of local legends and urban legends, is that as much as we want it to be true, we desperately don't want it to be true. I've never been back to Hope Cemetery, at least not to try to climb into it. I have driven past it. I've been by there a few times as an adult. And the real story is I don't know if there is a grave that has slowly risen up over time. I know that there are stories about that sort of thing happening in New Orleans, where you're under sea level there. That tends to happen. I have heard of stories where when there's massive flooding, that sometimes bodies will float up to the top, and maybe that informs the story. I don't know. But the point is that the legend of Hope Cemetery is something that terrified me as a child, but inspires me as a writer, as an adult. That idea of a cemetery being something that was terrifying or scary, it was not unique to the local community of Otto, Texas, or where I grew up, Riesel and Mart. It wasn't unique to them. There's these stories all over the place about haunted cemeteries. And so in doing research for this particular podcast that I wanted to do, I wanted us to kind of look at a few that were local. Currently I live in College Station, Texas, and nearby there's Katy and there's Magnolia. And I did a little bit of research just to kind of figure out exactly what was going on with local cemeteries. And this one popped up in Katy. So in Katy, they have a blue light cemetery. So apparently this cemetery is located at the intersection of Highway 6 North and Patterson Road. So if anybody who's listening to this happens to have been there, you can perhaps comment and confirm whether you've seen this. The Bear Creek German Methodist Church was built on this site in 1879, but says it was proved to drain poorly. Anything near Houston is proved to drain poorly, FYI, because it's a swamp. It's kind of like our own New Orleans here in Texas. It's a little bit below sea level, so don't expect to not flood. That's kind of common. But anyway, they moved their congregation in 1902. In 1915, the church was destroyed by a storm and then quickly rebuilt. By the way, also mentioned that drainage was still a problem. Yeah, okay, Houston, drainage, always a problem. The church was moved in 1940 to a new location, and all this kind of goes on. But the legend describes a glowing blue orb traveling through the grounds at night. No one has footage of this form. Again, but I'm getting this from Katy Magazine Online, by the way, an article that they posted about several of these different haunted locations in Katy. There's a couple of others there from October 2019. So you might want to look that up, katymagazineonline.com. Katy Haunts and Legends and Spooky Traditions. So as you go through this, there's also another cemetery mentioned that immediately catches my attention, honestly, because it sort of sounds a little bit like the Hope Cemetery legend. Magnolia Cemetery has been around since 1900, and in this particular cemetery, there's a particular grave called the Witch's Grave. That right there is worth the price of admission, folks. If there is a witch's grave, if you like terrifying things, you should definitely go check those things out. This particular grave is one Barbara Snyder. Barbara Snyder was a German immigrant who passed away in 1911. Before I go into the supernatural element, can I just say it's very cool to go to cemeteries and look at these old headstones and just look at the dates that people were born in and what they lived through, what they saw. It's amazing. You'll go to some of these and you'll see people who lived and actually saw the Civil War, or people who saw and here in Texas, especially, who saw the Texas Revolution. That's just that's touching history to me. That's very cool. And if it's supernatural history, maybe don't touch it. Touching it's bad. So anyway, this one particular tombstone by Barbara Snyder is the legendary Katy Witch Grave. It says that it has an epitaph on her grave. And I'm going to read this here because I'm in the safety of my own home. I am not standing in front of it, so I do not think the curse will apply to me. But if you do not hear another podcast within a month, send someone. Thanks. Okay, so it says this: remember me as you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you soon shall be. Prepare for death and follow me. And the legend has it, if you say these words at her grave, you got to pay. I guess leave a coin or something. Otherwise, you get bad luck for the rest of your life. All right. They say that there have been tales of visitors who see the image of the witch behind them in mirrors. That sounds a little bit Bloody Mary-ish. So maybe there's a little bit of crossing of legends here. Not sure. But there's no real proof to that. Now, I am looking in this camera right here. I'm videoing this for those of you who are simply listening to the podcast. There is currently no witches behind me. I think I'm okay for now. Yeah, still good. Okay, so basically this is a great legend. I love the idea of this. You tag witch onto it and people immediately love it, think it's really cool. But apparently the Magnolia Cemetery also has another grave. The witch's grave is not the only one. Let's see, a paranormal visitor, a Lori St. Cyr, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, founded a group called KT Paranormal. And they visited in 2009. And what's cool about their particular story, also again here on this Katie Magazine online site, is that basically they went to look at the cemetery and they didn't catch the witch, but they did catch a ghostly child wearing a red hat and playing with a ball, ducking and playing hide and seek. And they claim to have a picture of it. So you can go see the picture there on Katie's website. And yeah, it's dark. I can't see anything. I don't really see. I see a shape, but could be a kid, may not be. But the point is this. I love local legends dealing with haunted cemeteries because I think they play with a deep core fear that we all have about death and what happens to us after we go. And since this podcast likes to talk not only about the legends, but also about the sociological impact of it, I think that what we could look at is that from a sociological perspective, it perhaps haunting a cemetery or the idea of a haunted cemetery has a couple of purposes. One, it warns us to not bother the dead, which I think is just in general a good idea. Let's not bother the dead. I, for one, am not a fan of Ouija boards. Don't ever play with one in my presence. I do not buy into it. I think it's bad. Yeah, I think it's terrifying. I don't want to mess with it. I think you're dabbling in things you perhaps shouldn't dabble in. So don't. And I think that's really maybe where these legends come from. Don't go touch the grave or you'll be captured. Well, guess what? It's going to make me not want to touch the grave, so I'm going to stay out. That's one thing. Because again, most of our urban legends that we look at are morality tales. They're telling us, don't do this or bad things will happen to you. They're warning us about that. And there is this idea in our culture of respecting the final resting place of someone. I was at a funeral not too long ago, and you know, as we were walking to the burial site at the graveside, being very cautious to not walk over someone's grave. Now, depending upon your particular faith background or belief set, what you're walking over is nothing but dust and bone. And so that soul is someplace else. You're not disrespecting that, yet there's something ingrained in us to be respectful to that. And I don't have a problem with that. I have no problem with the idea of, you know, not stepping on someone's grave or showing respect when one's at a cemetery. I think that's great. The backside to this is that by telling someone not to do something, that is the number one best way to get them to do it. And therefore, when you tell a bunch of preteen boys or young teenage boys, don't go to the cemetery and touch that grave, you just encourage them to do that very thing, which is what we did as 13-year-old boys. And we went to this this cemetery, and either because Matt was supernaturally pushed off of the fence, or Matt had a deep level unconscious sort of conscience, Jiminy Cricket, if you will, that pushed him back and kept us from going in there. I don't know. You have to ask Matt. But the point is, it sticks with me. I still remember that night. I still remember that event. And I still remember the thrill that it gave us to be testing the limits of not only life and death, but the supernatural. And playing with those things that, maybe we shouldn't play with. But isn't that what humanity is really all about? Asking those questions that we're kind of afraid to get the answer to. What happens after we die? Is there a God? Are there ghosts? Are there spirits? Are there aliens? Is there evil in the world? Maybe some of those we want an answer to. I believe there is a God, and as I'm doing this particular podcast about cemeteries and things that may rise from the dead on Easter Sunday, I believe in that. I believe that God is real, and I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. In the good way, not the zombie way that some people might believe. I believe that it was real. And if I believe that there is a God, and I believe that there is good, and that a man may die on the cross and come back to life, it stands to reason that I might believe that there are equal and opposites to that as well. That there are demons, that there are evil spirits that are out to manipulate, damage, and hurt the world. And maybe that's not an answer I want to hear, or maybe it's not an answer you want to hear. But if spirits are real, and they are both good and bad, maybe we should take caution in how we address them in the real world. Now, in fiction, have at it, have fun. And if you're into that, read the books that I write. Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles, Rites of Passage is the first book in the series. I have followed that up with Red Hand Rising, Bane of Nostalgia, and Fall of Man. The final book, Afterlife, will be coming out this summer, very, very soon. And it deals with a lot of these things, the questions of life and death, and good and evil, and spirits and angels, and actually not angels, there's no angels there, but demons and God, and the question of where you fit in all these things. And it's full of action, it's full of humor, and it's a safe way to kind of ask those supernatural questions instead of going and climbing over a chain link fence and getting pushed around by spirits at Hope Cemetery. I'm Chad Lehrman, your host for Urban Legends Unmasked. Hope to see you next time.